Hey everyone, so One Piece chapter 1117 just came out, and we just concluded what I believe will go down as one of the greatest segments in all of One Piece. And I know what you're thinking, whoa, Morge. Look, we weren't all that crazy about Vegapunk's speech. I know some of you guys felt like it was dragging on a little bit too long, maybe took up a few too many chapters, but I believe that that is part of the weekly reading experience. It doesn't help that Oda took a significant number of breaks over the course of this speech, and some chapters it didn't feel like a ton of things happened. However, I believe in the grand scheme of things, when you are reading it in the flow of the full story, hitting Vegapunk's speech will feel surreal. Because this was the moment, this was the section of the story that everything finally came together. The curtain was pulled back on what the true stakes and conflict of this gigantic story are, what everything is being fought for, what the world once was, what we're trying to get it back to, what the final conflict of the story is going to revolve around preventing, namely the firing of the ancient weapon over and over again to increase the sea levels. And most importantly, this is the section of the story where, chapter to chapter, it felt like we're just skimming through a lot of different reactions, but when you read this whole thing from start to finish, you will feel the world of One Piece in its entirety, in a way that you really couldn't feel all in one at any other point in the story. We swept through everyone and everything over the course of this Vegapunk speech. This chapter alone, we even hit Krieg and Jin and Pearl. Many people believed that a Jin reappearance was just out of the question and never going to happen, but we finally got it, and when did we get it? We got it during Vegapunk's speech. Why? Because Oda is trying to make us feel like this is the entire planet of One Piece. This entire gigantic fantasy world that he has built over 1100 chapters, all of it is experiencing the shockwaves from Vegapunk's revelations. And so even just now, when you read through this speech, just the speech from start to finish, you will get a reminder of how vast the story has been and how many characters and places and people we've covered. And I really do think that might be part of why Oda took a lot of breaks during this period of time, just because I feel like he had to get this Vegapunk section of the story right. I don't think we're necessarily going to get as extensive if a sweeping view throughout the One Piece world again for some time, probably not till the final arc when really everything's coming together. So at this moment in time, the kicking off point for the climax of the story, when you kind of gotta drop the hammer and be like, here's what is going on, here is the problem, here are the bad guys that everybody needs to worry about because the whole world is about to come to an end unless somebody stops them. This needed to have a worldwide effect. And I think that we're not going to really get something like this again for some time. So honestly, the storytelling style of it, of having one dramatic monologue playing out over the course of 4 or 5 chapters, while everything else that the Straw Hats and the protagonists are doing kind of just shifts to the background and becomes almost white noise surrounding the poignancy of the truth bombs that Vegapunk is dropping on us and the rest of the One Piece world. I thought that was a very unique style of writing for One Piece that we've never really seen before, at least not played out at this length over this many chapters. And I personally loved it. I can understand why people may have been getting a little bit tired of it over time, but I promise you, reading Egghead Island in one go, and honestly, the real value again will be when you read the entire story of One Piece in one go, and you just get to this section, and it's just like, wow, this is where the whole thing comes together. This is where the beginning of the end is officially marked down. I think that this will go down as a legendary section of One Piece. We're just not going to feel it just yet because we want to get back to the action. And luckily, we did get a good amount of action this chapter. So I want to talk about the Gorosei and the Iron Giant, as well as Zoro and Venus Juro. We're going to talk about Zoro and Venus Juro first. So this was the matchup that many people have been waiting on. This is not some Zoro versus Lucci Mickey Mouse stuff. This is what the people have wanted, and I've talked about in many past videos how I did believe that Venus Juro is likely to be Zoro's final opponent. At one point, for fun, I did entertain the possibility of Mars as a mix-up, but generally I've been fairly consistent in my belief that Venus Juro would be Zoro's final opponent. Why? Because for a long time, I've believed that the ranking of the Gorosei goes something like this: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and then Saturn. Simply following down the line the order of planets: top planet, planet closest to the sun, Mercury being the strongest, planet furthest away from the sun, Saturn being the weakest. I think that's what most of us have observed, with Mercury, Venus, Juro, and Mars being generally the most competent, effective, and intimidating of the Gorosei, and Saturn being a little wishy-washy wishy-washy, and Jupiter just basically barely even being there, almost a non-presence. And in particular, Warcry has seemed a bit like the strongest powerhouse among the Gorosei, both in terms of the difficulty that he posed for Luffy, even Gear 5th Luffy in challenging him, and what he just did this chapter as kind of the one to take out the Iron Giant, but again, we're going to get to that in the end. I do think that Venus Juro being the second strongest of the Gorosei makes a lot of strength, as it makes Venus Juro pretty much the perfect opponent for Zoro. Historically speaking, we've always been used to Zoro fighting the strongest subordinate, such as a Mr. One or an Ohm, but I think in post-time skip things have kind of shifted around a little bit because there have been a lot more characters every arc, so Zoro's not necessarily always fighting the strongest subordinate. For example, I don't think Pika was necessarily Doflamingo's strongest subordinate. I feel like Virgo might have been, so that went to Law there, and then I think in Wano, while King was the strongest subordinate there, you would most likely say that out of all the characters in the Wano arc, it was Kaido, then Big Mom, and then King. So in a sense, Zoro again did not really fight the number 2 of that arc, which was really Big Mom. I mean, she was right up there with Kaido, right? So again, I think just in general, we might just have to get used to the idea with so many characters. I mean, Dragon's going to be involved in the final saga, Blackbeard's going to be involved in the final saga, Akainu might even need a matchup or something like that. So it's possible that the strongest Gorosei, Warcry, does end up going to somebody else. Again, if I had to place my bets, I think Dragon might be a really good option, but Venus Juro being the second strongest of the Gorosei, a swordsman, the Kitetsu connection, I think that is a perfect final opponent for Zoro. And just the fact that we're getting such an early clash between the two that seemed as impressive as it was, because this was a true high-level hockey clash. Whatever we were seeing between Zoro and Lucci, there wasn't a lot of black lightning flying around. There was some from Zoro's end when it came time to finish the fight, but you just understand that the top tiers are the ones that are going to have the crazy amounts of black lightning and hockey and everything like that in their fights, and that's really what we kind of want to see if we're seeing Zoro versus Gorosei, especially because the Gorosei have been hyped up. As Jinbei said earlier, their hockey is just unreal. So getting to see Zoro, kind of how a lot of fans want to see Zoro having these big hockey clashes with top tier characters, that is a step towards getting to see Zoro as the world's strongest swordsman soon. I'm just not gonna lie, the Lucci stuff was not cutting it. I was like, I don't know how he's gonna beat Mihawk anytime soon if this is where he's at now. But it feels good to see Zoro getting one significant clash, one significant interaction with a top tier character before the end of this arc. And from what it seems like, it's possible that Zoro versus Venus Juro might continue onwards a little bit further. Because right now we're at that part of the arc where most everything has been checked off, but the Strats need to figure out a way to escape. And this could take a very short amount of time, a la, say, Enies Lobby, where they were able to figure out an escape route in the nick of time within 2-3 chapters. Or it could go the route of Whole Cake Island, where it seemed like they were in the home stretch, and then we got another 20-30-ish chapters added on towards the end of the arc, with the climax being much longer than we expected. I don't think we're getting another Whole Cake Island situation, but at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if this whole battle takes a little bit longer to wrap up than, the next few chapters or so. One of the things that did happen that kind of surprised me was that the Iron Giant seemed to have been defeated somewhat easily. I think a lot of us had expectations for the Iron Giant, and I don't think that those were completely unfounded because, there was a lot of drama and build up to this Iron Giant getting back up, right? This was the Iron Giant that once rampaged through Marijua. This was possibly a former comrade of Joy Boy. This was a giant that, Oda really put a lot of time and theatrics into building up the suspense of what the Iron Giant's gonna do. We got, cliffhanger of the Iron Giant waking up, the Iron Giant's beginning to walk around, the Iron Giant seems to be unstoppable in a sense. It's genuinely just a towering, gigantic behemoth. And then we find out that the Denden Mushi is actually coming from inside the Iron Giant. All of this is really, really exciting, and we're building up, it seems like, to some sort of confrontation with the Iron Giant as the final guardian of the transmission, but instead it's more like, okay, as soon as the Gorosei realize that that's where the transmission is coming from, they just take out the Iron Giant in one hit, and then all is over. So, Vegapunk, world's smartest man, he banked a lot on the Iron Giant. I guess it did do its job in terms of being the last place that the Gorosei suspected, but he was not much of a guardian at the end of the day. Now, whether or not the Iron Giant is done for remains to be seen. At the very least, the transmission cut out. Again, I do think that this makes Warcry look like probably the most important or most significant of the Gorosei, just because out of all the Gorosei, one, you didn't need all of them to take out the Iron Giant, but two, Warcry is the one that Oda had do it. I just generally think that Oda's been having Warcry get kind of the best stuff so far. But that leads us to the most important point of the chapter, and the most difficult to unravel, which is the transmission getting cut off. So, This is a very interesting situation because over the course of my stream, I was able to communicate with some Japanese speakers who were able to explain to me why this is a tricky situation to figure out. So, my understanding is that in Japanese, there are some words or phrases, so for example, laugh tail, the way that it's spelled out in Japanese characters, it is actually producing the word laugh tail. So that play on words raft tail being laugh tail, it's intentional to sound that way in English. However, when it comes to this situation with mo, that's the actual Japanese sound, as I understand, that's being cut off. However, we don't know if it's to a Japanese word or to an English word, and those would be two very, very different things. Like, is it supposed to be something like laugh tail, in which case it would be kind of like la being cut off, or is it actually the start to some genuine Japanese word, in which case the mo beginning to whatever the full word is going to be, that word in English is not even going to begin with mo, which would make this translation, in hindsight, completely irrelevant. Now, it's possible that the translations that come out on Sunday have more clarity on this, because it's possible that Oda actually is going to give Viz some input on what is or isn't correct. At the same time, if he does that, I wonder if it gives away a little bit too much what the word might be, so it's a tricky situation. It also means that it's almost impossible to theorize on what this actual full word mo might mean, because again, it could just be a word in Japanese and not actually cutting off the start of an English word. So there's no way to guess it, is basically what we're at. Unless, of course, you're a Japanese native speaker, in which case you probably understand the litany of words that could be coming out that this could be in Japanese and maybe come up with a theory from that. But I unfortunately have nothing. If there are any Japanese speakers who have some more input on this, then please let me know in the comments below. And lastly, out of all the characters whose reactions we saw this chapter, I think the most important ones were from Sword. And with regards to Sword, we've got a great point from the Voice of the People, which is my top tier of patrons. So Zuko09 says, "It's our turn to step up. Sword has always known and been preparing a rebellion in the Marines. To say it's our turn makes me think that they've been waiting for something like this to happen. I think this confirms that this was the true secret purpose of the Sword organization. I do believe that the purpose of Sword in the long term was to lead to some level of reform within the Marines. Now, whether or not they were planning on some sort of military coup or civil war amongst the Marines, I have no idea. However, two things are possible here. One, which is that when they're saying it's our turn now, it could be more so in reference to going up against the Celestial Dragons. We know that CP0, Aegis, it represents shield, right? So Sword being the counterpart to that, it might be more so that Sword has always planned on doing something about the Celestial Dragons, as they view that as the ultimate problem in the world. So with the new information coming out of this broadcast and the world about to go into turmoil, maybe Sword views this actually as an opportunity to do something about the reigning regime. As for the flip side, with them maybe wanting to take the reins over among the Marines against Akainu and everything like that, because I think that while Sword definitely views the upper levels of the world government and the Celestial Dragons currently as problematic, within the Marines themselves, you know, these are still their co-workers, these are still people that they know and likely respect to some degree. I mean, as far as we know, I don't think Garp or Sengoku are even members of Sword. I don't know if Fujitora is even a member of Sword. So for some of the Marines of Sword to want to take over the Marines from the inside, I think that is a very, very bold direction that they might go. But in general, I've talked about in past videos why I do think that the Marines as a whole, not being on the Celestial Dragon side and trying to create their own third party, is very, very likely in the final war. So let's see where that goes. And finally, we have one more Voice of the People. Nolan002 says, "Hoping to see the Iron Giant versus the Gorosei next chapter. If he can hold them off by himself, it really gives us a base level of Joy Boy's potential crew." So I do hope that the Iron Giant is able to fight a bit more and keep going, just because it feels like, you know, a heavyweight match that I guess turned out to be a little bit more disappointing. But just the allure of this Giant maybe representing Joy Boy's crew or his followers in some way does make us want to see the Giant be impressive in some way, right? However, at the same time, I wouldn't imagine anything as crazy as the Iron Giant holding off, you know, 4 or 5 Gorosei at the same time. Maybe it happens, but I'm just thinking that Luffy's crew is probably supposed to be as strong or stronger than Joy Boy's crew at the end of the day. And I don't even imagine end of story Zoro handling, you know, 4 or 5 Gorosei at the same time. If anything, I think Zoro versus Venus Juro would be a really great endgame matchup. So the Iron Giant representing Joy Boy's crew, I do want the Iron Giant to be impressive in some manner, but at the same time not at the expense of the Gorosei, who Oda has done a phenomenal job hyping up as these endgame threats and really making them seem competent, powerful, and very difficult to deal with over the course of this arc. So let's see how that balance plays out next week. And that's all for this video, so watch out for next week's video, and I will talk to you all later.